How do you see the human rights situation in China over the past 30 years? When you were appointed as the executive director of Human Rights Watch, Deng Xiaoping was the paramount leader during that time. Were you more optimistic about China's human rights situation back then?
Well, yes. I mean, under Deng Xiaoping, there was a serious reform process taking place and significant, not simply economic opening, which is what he's most known for, but also political opening. China was a much more open place politically. Now that came to a screeching, violent halt with the massacre of many of the participants in the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy movement in 1989. Although even after Tiananmen, what was interesting is that there was still a degree of dissent allowed. There was a bit of public conversation. Even social media in China had diverse points of view for a while. And it really is Xi Jinping who has brought that political diversity to a close. I think it's safe to say that China today is as repressive as it has been since the days of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And indeed, Xi Jinping seems to hearken back to the days of Mao Zedong and tries to assert, a genuine dictatorship of the Communist Party where dissent is simply not allowed. Public criticism is not allowed. But that's how governments make big mistakes. When you have a leader who surrounds himself with sycophants, a leader who doesn't have the self-confidence to have free debate and even criticism, that's when that leader makes enormous mistakes. And I'm afraid that we're beginning to see that now from Xi Jinping.
In 1989, the Tiananmen massacre has shocked the world. Since then, student leaders and dissidents fled China to countries like the US. As for Hong Kong, people who have participated in the 2019 movement have been leaving the city, especially after the imposition of the national security law. Do you see similarities between the two groups?
Hong Kong represented a refutation of Xi Jinping's claim that the people in China wanted his dictatorial rule. Obviously, there is no election in China. There is no free debate. People have no capacity to express their views one way or the other without risking prison. So this is just an assertion. Xi Jinping says, in essence, I'm a dictatorship, but the people want that because we're going to give them economic growth. And he just asserts that this is the will of the Chinese people. Now, the one place in the part of China controlled by the government where people did have the freedom to choose was Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, they made 100% clear that the last thing they wanted was the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party. And so it became necessary, in order for Xi Jinping to preserve his legitimacy, to continue with this lie that the Chinese people have chosen as dictatorship, he had to crush those freedoms in Hong Kong. He had to make it impossible for the people of Hong Kong to express their views, just as he had already made it impossible on the mainland. All of them would rather be back in Hong Kong, back in China, wherever they fled from. That's their home. People don't like to leave their home. They leave it when they really can't survive, when they're stifled, and when being true to themselves, expressing their views, could lead to prison. And so, there is, I think, a natural affinity between Chinese people in exile who are still fighting for democracy, are still hoping for the rights for their people. And there will come a day where that's true. But in the meantime, the only way they can be true to themselves, they can express themselves, and they can continue this battle for human rights and democracy is from abroad, because to do that within China is a recipe for long-term imprisonment.
Some people have said that during Hitler's era, Jewish people have been fleeing to other countries in the world, which is like a gift for other countries. And now we can see that people in Hong Kong or even dissidents in China, they are fleeing as well. Do you see some similarities between them?
People are fleeing China today the way they have fled other highly abusive, repressive governments historically. That is certainly true. That is true of, my father who fled Nazi Germany. It's true of the many, many people who fled the Soviet Union. It's true of people who today are fleeing Russia. The irony is that Putin's so-called mobilization, which was supposed to have secured 300,000 people for the Russian military, probably mobilized more people to flee abroad. This is what happens when you have dictatorships that are accountable only to their own political preservation, not to the welfare of their people. And sadly, that defines China today. look at the state of, of rural Han Chinese. That's, something that Xi Jinping deliberately doesn't want you to look at. He here in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council, China has put forward an almost revolutionary concept of human rights. That is to say, they have redefined what human rights mean. They don't want you to talk about, freedom of expression or the ability to choose your government or even the right to education or medical treatment or housing. They want to reduce human rights to just, is the economy growing? And that's not what it's about. In fact, the whole concept of economic and social rights says that, okay, whatever the size of the resources available to the government, are they devoting those to improve the welfare of the worst off segments of society? That's the last question Xi Jinping wants you to ask. He doesn't want you to ask about rural Han Chinese, let alone about the Uyghurs or the Tibetans. So he's, undercutting even economic and social rights, let alone civil and political rights. And then when it comes to how are human rights enforced, he would have you, only have polite conversations among governments with great deference to the sovereign choices of each country. In other words, leave me alone. Don't pressure me about my repression. That's the Xi Jinping philosophy. So this, is a really fundamental attack on the human rights system. It's not simply that the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping is ruthlessly violating the rights of the Chinese people, but they're trying to redefine human rights and redefine the enforcement of human rights to make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party dictatorship. That's why, what is at stake here is not simply the rights of the Chinese people, but the ability to have a viable human rights system for the entire world.
Authoritarian countries probably see you as a threat. You were sanctioned by China and you were expelled from Hong Kong in 2020 and denied entry into Egypt. How do you feel about that?
When that happens to me, I take that as a badge of honor, because, if a government has nothing to say in defense of its repression, if all it can do is lie and deny and try to keep the messenger away, it's in trouble. Because, when I was barred from entry into Hong Kong, it didn't prevent me from speaking. I mean, I flew back to New York and I held the same press conference that I wanted to hold in Hong Kong. I held it 2 days later at the United Nations in New York. So it didn't stop me, but it just showed that the Chinese government was afraid of having the Chinese people hear what I had to say. This fear of one's own people is typical of autocrats. If they really had the confidence of their people, if they knew that there could be free debate and free competition and a free election, and they would still prevail, they wouldn't need all the repression. The repression is because they are serving themselves, not their people, and they have to go to extraordinary lengths to prevent their people from having any say in determining their leadership. So, when a government keeps me out, if it takes the extraordinary step of expelling me or trying to block my message, I know that it's in trouble. I know that it really has nothing to say. And it's a sign of weakness that governments have to resort to such extreme measures.
Taiwan has evolved from dictatorship to one of the most vibrant democracies in the world. Could similar story happen to China one day?
Taiwan is an interesting case because the Chinese Communist Party would have the Chinese people believe that its dictatorship is necessary for economic progress. But Taiwan is a refutation of that claim because Taiwan has actually advanced far further, much farther along economically than mainland China. But it's done that, in recent years through a vibrant democracy. And it shows that, this claim that a dictatorship is necessary for economic advancement is demonstrably false. And that, is what makes me fearful about the future of Taiwan, because this is an example that I fear Xi Jinping cannot tolerate. Because again, just as Hong Kong undermined the legitimacy of Xi Jinping's claim to be a preferred dictatorship because it showed the Chinese people when they could have a voice didn't want him. But Taiwan refutes his claim that you need a dictatorship for economic advancement. Obviously you don't.